All right, welcome in once again, everyone, to the Rent Stabilization Division webinar. Today's topic is how to lawfully increase rent. This is a landlord-focused workshop. Anyone is welcome to join any of our workshops, but we will have some information primarily for landlords. And before we get started, I'll just mention that today's webinar is being recorded and we will be sending out this PowerPoint slideshow to everyone who registered today. So feel free to take any notes that are useful to you, but you will have the resources after today. Just briefly, I'll introduce myself. My name is Andrea Pena. I am part of the Rent Stabilization Division staff with the City of Mountain View. And just a reminder that city staff is not able to offer any legal advice. What we can share with you are tips, best practices, and an overview of the city programs and the rent stabilization laws. So we'll go over a few topics today. First, we'll just briefly discuss covered units under the rent stabilization laws. Then we'll talk about the rent increases, the new rent increase for 2025. We'll go into some noticing requirements, how to submit those notices, and then we'll speak about petitions for landlords and wrap up with some resources. And I'll just, before we get into this first topic, mention that if you have any questions, go ahead and type them in the chat or the Q&A function. I'll do my best to monitor those throughout the presentation. And if you already have a question sort of coming into it today, I'll try to make sure that we cover that throughout the presentation. Okay, so first, you are likely familiar with the Community Stabilization and Fair Rent Act. We refer to it as the CSFRA for short. And this is a voter-approved measure to stabilize the community by reducing housing turnover in some rental units by stabilizing rents, providing eviction protections, as well as ensuring a fair rate of return. So this law typically covers apartments in the city. And how do you know if an apartment or a unit is covered by the CSFRA? It's typically based on when the building was built, first was rented, and there are sort of two types of coverage you'll see: fully covered and partially covered. If you have a question about whether a unit is covered or not, or what type of coverage, it's best to contact our office. We have a database that we can definitely share some information from and get you the most accurate and up-to-date coverage. Then we have the Mobile Home Rent Stabilization Law, and this is a city council ordinance enacted to stabilize the community with these same goals in mind, but some of the protections apply to mobile home tenants and mobile home owners, and some only apply to mobile home tenants. So just something to keep in mind. But all mobile home parks in Mountain View are covered. There are 6 parks in the city. And I'll just briefly pause here if you have any questions about coverage or in general these rent stabilization laws. Okay, looks like we can continue for now. Okay, so we'll start getting into today's topic around allowed rent increases, what all to keep in mind. So first, how do we define rent? What is included in rent? Base rent you see here on the left includes the initial rent that the tenant is paying at move-in, and it also includes any housing services such as parking, pet fees, utilities that are not submetered, storage, and any other housing services you may provide. So that all falls under the category of rent. Allowed rent increases we'll speak a little bit more about the AGA, anything that is a result of a petition, as well as banked and bankable rent increases, which again, we'll touch on shortly. What is not considered rent for the purposes of the CSFRA are deposits. So anything charged at the beginning of the term typically is not increased during a tenancy. And if you have questions about that, again, happy to answer. And then you may have also heard there are some changes to the way utilities are addressed in the CSFRA. So for tenancies that started March 1st, 2024 or after, there are some new utility regulations, and this only applies to fully covered CSFRA units. So those partially covered CSFRA units and those MHRSO, those mobile home covered units, this does not apply to. But for these fully covered CSFRA units, ratio utility billing system is no longer allowed. So for tenants, their total rent should include the cost of utilities such as water, sewer, trash, things like PG&E that are submetered, meaning that the tenant is able to see how much they have used of that utility and therefore are responsible for that payment. That is okay, that can continue. And the rental agreements should state the total rent amount and specify this type of utilities, just like I listed. Water, sewer, garbage are typically the common ones that we see. And utility charges paid directly to the service provider, like I said, such as PG&E is a common one. Things like internet, of course, is the responsibility of the tenant since those are submetered. And I'll just point out one state law effective last summer is that in most cases, a security deposit is limited to 1 month's rent. So it can't exceed that. There are some special circumstances that are listed here where that may not apply. Okay. So when can you raise rent as a landlord? So landlords of fully covered CSFR units, as well as MHRSO, mobile homes, have to be in substantial compliance with the law in order to raise rent. And what does that mean? What does that look like? Here are a few examples. First, if a rollback of rent was applicable to a unit, that had to be in effect to set the correct base rent level. Second, there cannot be any unlawful rent increases or overcharges to tenants. If that is the case, those need to be reversed and refunded before a rent increase can be given. Third, a landlord must pay all applicable rental housing fees or space rental fees, whatever applies. This is an annual charge. And fourth, the landlord must register the property with the rent stabilization division online. We'll talk a little bit more about that. If you have questions, we'd be more than happy to help direct you to the right place to make sure you're in compliance with this particular piece. And then fifth, a landlord must not have any outstanding code violations on the property, generally maintain the property in substantial compliance with state and local health and safety laws. So all of this needs to be in order for a landlord to give a legal rent increase under the CSFRA and the MHRSO. Okay, and what can these rent increases look like? First, we'll speak about the CSFRA. So the annual general adjustment, which you'll hear referred to as AGA, you can just think of it as the allowed rent increase for that particular time, are effective each year starting September 1st. So it goes from September 1st of one year to August 31st of the next year. And it's set by a 2% floor and a 5% ceiling based on the rate of inflation is what the Rental Housing Committee uses to set that each year. And for the MHRSO, this is a recent change in the MHRSO. The AGA will be between 0% and 3% based on 60% of the CPI rate of inflation. So for the CSFRA, starting September 1st of this year, so coming up here in a couple of months, the allowed rent increase will be 2.7%. A reminder that only one rent increase can be given every 12 months. So it has to be a full year or more before you can give a rent increase. And for the MHRSO this year, there is an AGA of 1.6% within the same time period. So like I mentioned, things are a little bit different for the mobile home rent stabilization. As of March of this year, the City Council made some changes to the way the AGA is calculated moving forward. Okay, so you may be wondering, how can you give a rent increase that may be larger than the AGA? One way is through a banked rent increase. So banked rent increases are when you apply previously unused or partially used AGAs from previous years. So banked increases from past years can be combined with a current AGA for a total of 10%. It can't exceed 10%, but you can do anywhere 10% or less. And importantly, banked increases cannot be transferred from owner to owner. So if you recently purchased a property, just double check that you are not using banked increases from a previous owner. And of course, once a tenant moves in, that sort of starts the time that they're eligible for those increases. And another way that you may be able to give a rent increase that is different than the AGA or above it is through a petition of upward adjustment of rent. These are landlord petitions that can be filed with the city. The first is the Maintenance of Net Operating Income, MNOI for short, petition, which ensures a reasonable and fair rate of return on a rental property. This can be filed when a property is no longer able to operate at a profitable rate as compared to the base year. And the second is through a specified capital improvement petition when there is a qualifying capital improvement that has been done on the property. So if you have questions about either of these, we have lots of forms and resources to help you through this process. You're definitely not in it alone. If you think you may be eligible, you're just interested in knowing a little bit more, we'd be happy to set up an appointment to discuss in more detail about these two types of landlord petitions. And then on the other side, tenants are also able to file a petition with our division. One that is sort of applicable to this discussion of rent increases is the tenant hardship petition. So tenants can file this petition if they receive a rent increase that's larger than the AGA, which was the result of a banked rent increase or a landlord petition. So like it says here in the green box, this is important. Tenants can only request a hardship on the rent increase amount that exceeds the current AGA. So they can't petition to say, I can't have any rent increase, it has to be 0. They are still eligible for the AGA itself. And just a graphic here to show when can a hardship be claimed. The rent increase has to be larger than the AGA of that given year. And there has to be an increase based on a banked amount, or a landlord petition, and the tenant has to meet certain eligibility criteria for the household. In those cases, they may be able to file a hardship petition. Again, if tenants or landlords have questions about any of these requirements, forms, anything like that, more than happy to answer questions about that. And just to give you a breakdown, just to sort of share what the eligibility criteria is, it's based on the household. So a couple different factors come into play. First is the income of the household, which you'll see in the chart at the bottom of the screen here. The area median income, AMI, changes each year. And if the household has inadequate income or is severely rent burdened, meaning that 50% or more of their income is used towards rent, they may be eligible for a tenant hardship. In this sort of second category here, we see based on the residence of the household. So if there is a person under the age of 18, over the age of 62, or someone who is disabled or terminally ill, there's a different category of income that may make them eligible, or there may be other extenuating circumstances that would make them eligible to file that petition. And like I mentioned briefly earlier, there are some updates to utilities and rent under the CSFRA fully covered units. So I'll just touch on that briefly. For the tenants, we were talking earlier about the tenants that are newer, that have moved in March 1st, 2024 or after. Those tenants should already have utilities as part of rent. To address tenants that moved in before that date, so before March 1st, 2024, and they pay utilities separate from rent and to the landlord or a third party, such as Conservice is one common one, but there are many others. This is not going to be allowed any longer. So these monthly utility charges are sort of going up and down, not based on how much that tenant is using, but based on, for example, how much the whole building is using of any particular utility. Since the CSFRA states that utility costs are part of rent and rent cannot, be fluctuating, that's why this is no longer allowed. Once again, submetered utilities, such as a PG&E bill that's going directly to that tenant based on how much gas and electricity that tenant is using or that household is using, that is okay. That is exempt from these changes. So if a landlord has implemented this ratio utility billing system, they can file a utility adjustment petition with our division to address this issue, essentially to incorporate separately charged utilities into the total rent amount. And what is the result of this process is that the RUBS bills will no longer be charged, and the utilities will be a fixed amount included in the tenant's rent. And once again, the tenants will not receive separate utility bills through RUBS at the end of this process. We have a website down here on the bottom, mountainview.gov/RUBS, where we have all of the forms, lots of resources to help better explain this process. And an overview here of when the initial submittal due date is. This is based on the number of units on the property. So for larger properties with 20 or more units, those have already been submitted. For properties with 6 to 20 units, we have a couple of months left here. September 30th is the due date. And for our properties that are fully covered under the CSFRA, have 1 to 5 units, that is due at the end of this year. I will pause again here to see if you have any questions. Again, you can go ahead and type the Q&A or in the main chat. I can see both of those here. Okay, not seeing any questions. We'll go ahead and move forward. Feel free to ask questions at any point. Okay, now we're going to speak a bit more about noticing requirements. So for rent increases in particular, there is a required information sheet that is provided by the Rent Stabilization Division. It's on the website. I'll show you shortly how to access that. That is a required document that you need to attach with new leases, rental agreements, as well as each rent increase that is given to the tenants. Then there's the rent increase notice itself. This needs to be given at least 30 days in advance of the effective date of that increase. And once again, that can only be given once every 12 months. For rent increases that have a banked rent increase, a copy of that also needs to be submitted to the city within 7 days. So there is an additional sort of noticing requirement that we see here for banked rent increases. There also needs to be some required text in that notice that describes the tenant hardship that we spoke about a few minutes ago. I'll show you what that looks like and again, where you can access that document. So this here is the Rent Stabilization Division website. For short, you can type mountainview.gov/rent stabilization, or just go to the main city homepage and navigate there. You will see on the left navigation menu, there is a page for landlords. So once you click in that, you'll see here on the right, we have different topics that you can learn more about. The one that we are focusing on right now is circled. It's called Required Forms and Notices for Landlords. This is where you can download all of those up-to-date forms. This is on the left where you can see the required information sheet on the website. And then on the right, this is the first page of that document. So you just click on each of those links and it will pull up a PDF that you can download and print and save for your records and for your rent increases. I'll note here that there are different required, required information sheets for fully covered and for partially covered units, since there are different areas of the law that apply. And then we also provide rent adjustment templates. You're welcome to use this for your standard rent increases if you would like. They are particularly useful for banked rent increases. It's a little small here, but you may be able to see here, it lists all of the previous AGAs from past years. So you can easily do the math about what may be allowed if you're choosing to use a banked rent increase. And then here we have the back side of that form, which has included the mandatory language for that banked rent increase. So it's already in this template if you choose to use it, or you can use your own template, but just make sure to include that language if you are using a banked increase. Okay. Any questions about this point, about noticing? All right. Now we're gonna talk about online registration and how you can submit some of those required notices. So as you likely know, property registration exemptions are due January 31st of each year. That is done online on the portal. Registration updates, such as if there's a new tenancy, if there's a termination of a tenancy, or there's an ownership or management change, that needs to be submitted on the portal within 30 days of that change. And then there are some required notices that you need to submit copies of as well. Like we mentioned, the banked rent increase notice should be submitted a copy within 7 days, termination notices within 3 days, termination notice follow-up, such as an unlawful detainer paperwork, should be submitted within 7 days, and tenant buyout agreement within 15. Up here we have the website of the registration portal, and you can update contact information here, apply for exemptions, and then how you will submit those required notices or updates to the registration once it's submitted is there are three dots there on the right side of a unit information, and that will pull up a menu to manage any updates to that unit, including submitted banked rent increases, termination notices, or just editing the rent for that tenant. And this is what you will see come up when you go to file a banked rent increase notice copy online. Okay. And now I'll share some additional resources that may be helpful for you. First, like I already mentioned, our website has lots of information for landlords. It has lots of templates, fact sheets. We have a very thorough frequently asked questions for both the CSFRA and the MHRSO that goes into a lot of detail about basically every topic that you can imagine under these laws, additional occupants, rent increases, evictions, all of that. So be sure to check that out on our website. We also have a weekly housing help center for landlords. Right now it's every Thursday in the afternoon between 1 and 3 p.m. And you can either join us in our office at 298 Escuela Avenue. This is a small office building. It looks like a house from the outside, and it is right across the parking lot of the senior center in Mountain View. If you're familiar, feel free to just walk in there. You don't need an appointment, or you can join us online virtually at mountainview.gov/housing-help-clinics. And here are just some of the topics that you may want to visit us for. And here is our contact information, our phone number, email address, and again, the website and where to visit our office. And then here on the right, we have our office hours. These are held every Tuesday on Zoom between 10 a.m. and noon, and the link is just down there. Again, this is open for landlords, tenants, anyone who has questions about rent stabilization division. And we have staff that speak Spanish as well, if anyone would like that as well. And I wanted to mention some webinars that we have coming up for landlords. First is one all around that utility adjustment petition. That's July 17th at 2 p.m. And then in August, we have one around filing capital improvement petitions, how you may be able to recuperate some costs on your property. Definitely check that out if you have something in mind on your property or just want to learn a little bit more about what that can look like. And you can join that the same way you joined today's webinar, mountainview.gov/RSP webinars. And sharing here a couple of legal resources. First is the Santa Clara County Bar Association referral service, as well as the county's self-help center. Okay, let's see if we have any questions. I see one here. Um, when do you anticipate our petitions to be approved by the city? Um, I'm assuming you're asking about the utility adjustment petition, the one-time utility adjustment petition. We are in the process of reviewing these petitions. If you want to email me directly, I can give you a more specific timeline for your property. You can email that MV Rent email, and I would be happy to provide you more information. Any other questions that we might have? Okay, good question. What is the fair rate of return and how is it calculated? Let's see if I can navigate back to this slide. There we go. So the MNOI petition compares a base year compared to a most current year. And so you'll submit lots of documentation, expenses, and we'll help you make that calculation. There we have an Excel workbook that provides lots of automatic calculations. So we'll help you gather a list of all of the documents that you will need to file this petition. And then it's pretty simple. Once we have all of that documentation, we'll just plug it into the Excel workbook and it will produce a final number here. And I will also be happy to share sort of an explainer that we have about that. I'll email that to you. I just took a note of your name and email here. So I will go ahead and share more information about that with you. Okay, any other questions that come up? Okay. Okay, I'm seeing one question about rent increases and the utility adjustment. So I'll just read it out first for everyone. Can you confirm that the landlord can give an AGA on September 1st of this year? And then once the REPS petition is approved for the utility adjustment, if it's an upward adjustment, can we give the tenant essentially apply that 12 months after the last adjustment? Okay. So you can give the rent increase if they're eligible, if the tenant is eligible this September. And then I believe I'm understanding your question correctly. So once the utility petition is all finalized, we help you calculate if the adjustment for this tenant, let's say tenant A, is an upward adjustment of rent or a downward adjustment of rent. If it's an upward adjustment of rent, meaning that the utility adjustment may be slightly higher than the average of what the tenant was already paying for utilities previously, then there has to be a 12-month period, just like a typical rent increase. So if you gave the rent increase September 1st of this year, let's say the petition is finalized in December, then it would be next September 2026 that that utility adjustment would be applied. Hopefully that answers your question, but we'll definitely help you sort of apply those utility adjustments once we get to that point in your particular utility adjustment petition. We have templates for you as well as some sort of automated processes to help you with that noticing. Okay. And yes, you can continue to charge REBs to those tenants until the utility adjustment is applied, correct? Okay, any other questions that we may have today? Let me just head back to our contact information so that you um, can ask any questions that come up after today's session via email, by stopping by our office, joining our Housing Help Center, or our virtual office hours. All right, well, thank you everyone so much for joining today. My name is Andrea, and I really appreciate you coming to learn a little bit more about the rent stabilization laws today. Have a great afternoon.